Hey, what's up everybody? It is Mr. Boylan, and today we're going to start our new unit on acids and bases. As you take a look at the content objective for today's video, we're going to explain how chemical equilibrium reasoning can be used to describe the proton transfer reactions of acid-base chemistry. All right, so there's a lot there. We're going to start specifically in this video talking about first how we define acids and bases according to both the Arrhenius definition and the Bronsted-Lowry definition. And secondly, we're going to identify and explain the concept of Bronsted-Lowry acid-base conjugate pairs. So those are the two big things we're going to do today. All right, so we're going to start with the Arrhenius definition of acids and bases. An Arrhenius acid is going to be anything that will increase the hydrogen ion concentration in solution. In other words, it'll be a hydrogen ion donor. An Arrhenius base will be anything that increases the hydroxide ion concentration in solution. In other words, something that has a hydroxide ion to donate in solution. As you take a look at your notes, you've got a couple of examples of both an Arrhenius acid and Arrhenius base, two things that will increase either the hydrogen ion concentration or hydroxide ion concentration in solution, respectively. Okay, so a quick thing to keep in mind when we talk about the Arrhenius definition that is often confusing for students. The hydrogen ion and the hydronium ion are often used interchangeably when we talk about these things in problems. It's important to recognize, and as you look at your notes, that you can see them represented both ways. That first representation is just showing the ionization of your hydrochloric acid molecule into the hydrogen ion and the chloride ion. But it's more accurately represented, that second format there, whereby we have the hydrogen ion and the chloride ion from the hydrochloric acid molecule and the water molecule there. When they interact, yes, the HCl is donating a hydrogen ion, but it's quickly picked up by a water molecule to form the hydronium ion. So just recognize hydrogen ion, hydronium ion, interchangeable. Okay, and that brings us to the Bronsted-Lowry definition of acids and bases. Bronsted-Lowry acid is defined as a proton donor. Well, the hydrogen ion is essentially a proton, so anything that is an Arrhenius acid is also a Bronsted-Lowry acid. Bronsted-Lowry bases are defined as proton acceptors, or anything that will gain a hydrogen ion. So recognize that although the Arrhenius and Bronsted-Lowry definition for acids are essentially identical, the Bronsted-Lowry definition of bases expands the number of things that we can define as a base to things that may not contain a hydroxide ion. A second and really important thing that we're going to talk about is that Bronsted-Lowry allows us to set up or illustrate reversible reactions. Equilibrium! Okay, so as you take a look at the original forward reaction there, we've got our acid molecule, which has that hydrogen ion in it, and our base molecule. And in the forward reaction, you've got a proton donor, your acid, and a proton acceptor, your base. However, let's now talk about the reverse direction. That thing that had accepted the hydrogen ion in the forward direction will now act as a proton donor or an acid in the reverse direction. So Bronsted-Lowry allows us to set up sort of these equilibria situations that we're going to see a lot in this acid-base unit. All right, and that brings us to the final concept for this video, which is looking at the Bronsted-Lowry definition of acids and bases and identifying what are called acid-base conjugate pairs. And an acid-base conjugate pair is simply going to be a pair of things that differ by one hydrogen ion. So as you look at the first example in your notes, you've got sulfuric acid reacting with water to form the hydrogen sulfate and hydronium ion in solution. And as you look at this reaction and try to identify the first acid-base conjugate pair, let's start with the sulfuric acid. This would be identified as a Bronsted-Lowry acid or a proton donor. Its conjugate base pair is going to be the hydrogen sulfate ion. In other words, it's the thing that's left after the sulfuric acid has donated its proton. There is a second conjugate pair in this reaction though. As we take a look at the water molecule, it is acting as a base or a proton acceptor. Its conjugate acid is what forms after it has accepted the proton. So again, a conjugate acid-base pair is simply going to be two things that differ by the presence of one hydrogen ion in solution. In the second example, we're going to look at both the forward and reverse reaction, and we'll talk about why in a later video. But the goal here is to identify the conjugate acid-base pairs. In the forward direction, recognize that we've got our water molecule, which is now acting as an acid. In other words, it is acting as a proton donor. Its conjugate base, or what's left after the proton is donated, is the hydroxide ion. Our second conjugate pair in this reaction, we've got the ammonia molecule acting as a base or a proton acceptor. Its conjugate acid is the ammonium ion. In other words, it's what has formed after the ammonia molecule has accepted a proton. Now, take a quick look at the conjugate pairs that we've identified here, because if we look at this reaction now in the reverse direction, we're going to look now at the ammonium ion, which is acting now as an acid or a proton donor. Its conjugate base is the ammonia molecule. And if you think about how we identify it, it's still the same pair, but as you think about this in the forward direction, we said ammonia is our base, ammonium ion is the conjugate acid. And the reason why it's a conjugate acid is because in the reverse direction, it's now acting as a proton donor. So again, as you look at that second pair that we identified in the forward direction, we still have it as the same conjugate acid-base pair. Recognize, though, that now we're looking at it in the reverse direction. In equilibrium, you've got this back and forth. You have this dynamic state. Okay, and then the last thing to think about is this idea of an amphiproduct or amphoteric species. And this is just a vocabulary word that you really need to be familiar with, which simply asks you to recognize that there are things that can behave as either an acid or a base. As you think back to the examples that we just went through, water is the prime example of something that can act as both an acid or a base. But recognize there are other things that have these amphoteric properties. They've got to have a hydrogen ion in order to act as an acid, to donate, but they also have to have a lone pair to act as a base, to accept that proton. So just keep that in mind as you are working through the idea of Bronsted-Lowry acid-base conjugate pairs.